for many people, the challenge is probably more on the side of not actually successfully getting there than spending too long in there. It would take for the brain to begin to center its attention towards this like hyper focus flow state type area. It's going to take at least 15 minutes of staying on exactly the same tasks. So when we're trying to get towards these states, the first thing is, are you only doing one thing, or are you on your computer doing lots of things at once?
TJ, it is so good to have you here today. I'm a big fan of your content. Very excited about the new book that I've had the joy of reading in advance, The Dose Effect. Very excited about it coming out. Firstly, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Angela. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be talking to you. And I've actually not read anything quite like this. And it's so user friendly, is what I would say.
That's good.
And very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think although being someone that's written a book, you'd expect me to be someone that has like an amazing attention span, all that sort of stuff. I actually really don't, and have struggled with that sort of stuff for all my life. And reading in general has been something that's been a lot of work for me to get good at throughout my life. And when I had the opportunity to then write a book, I wanted to write it in a way that was very easy to digest effectively, a lot more kind of imagery and visuals to kind of break up the text and make it pretty digestible.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that really struck me, was just how kind of accessible it is, but it doesn't dilute the science, which is great. Let's start with your story. It's a pretty emotional story, I think, from how this all began. Can you kind of bring listeners into the picture?
Yeah, so I kind of had a interest in psychology from pretty young. I played golf at a high level as like a super young kid. That got me kind of interested in the world of psychology because golf is a stressful sport. And then I, from about the age of like 14, 15, was someone that was pretty inclined towards addictive type behaviors. As soon as I got access to like sugar or alcohol, like I began finding these things hard, social media and so on. And then between the ages of 16 and 21, 5 people in my family passed away, which is obviously really savage to navigate as a young man. It would be savage for anyone to navigate. And 4 or 5 years, my coping strategy with that was just like mass distraction from the pain, using like booze or my phone, porn, whatever it might be, anything that could kind of give my brain big dopaminergic stimulation. And then throughout that time, I went to study psychology and neuroscience and had some pretty massive revelations as to what was actually impacting my brain chemistry and the actions I was taking. And gradually, as I matured, got sort of like 21, 22, I started thinking, wow, I need to change up my lifestyle. At this point, I was in a pretty low headspace, to be honest. And I did start using this idea of dose, of understanding these 4 brain chemicals, and saw like a rapid shift in how I felt. I was so shocked at how quickly I managed to transform how I was feeling through going down this lens, that I then decided maybe I could deliver this with companies. I was lecturing at Exeter University at the time. And yeah, the kind of story began from there.
Very powerful story. And I'm sorry you went through that. I think what's
Thanks.
come out of it is pretty amazing. And I'm someone who has struggled with mental health for like a big chunk of my life, and struggled particularly with the highs and the lows, of having sort of extreme highs and extreme lows. And I think that what really struck me when I was reading it is just how many things we can physically do. So for anyone listening to this who maybe is struggling with mental health, there's also things in there around ADHD. It really is kind of a user manual for building a better, not just brain, actually body and brain, because of the way the body interacts, which I know we're going to talk about. One of the things I've read in the book is that happiness is reality minus expectations. It's just a simple definition. Can you unpack that for us?
I actually think this is a very, very significant part of what's happening with mental health in the modern world. This is a kind of a phrase and a framework I came across a number of years ago. And it's the idea that our happiness is equal to the reality we're having minus the expectation we have of that reality. And if you look at your life, one of the difficulties we can experience is that we can set extremely high expectations for what we expect from our partners and our friends and our jobs and our finances and our holidays and everything. Even as simple as posting something on Instagram and expecting a high expectation of likes. We always are setting expectations. And there's this difficult thing that can occur, and this comes deep into how dopamine actually works in our brain. But if our reality does not meet the expectation we were seeking to attain, like if I give you an example, you've got a birthday coming up and you start giving this like huge expectation of it being the best birthday ever. I can't wait to see all my friends. It's going to be amazing. And you set this massive expectation, and then you turn up and it just isn't quite what you're expecting, because the expectation was so much higher than the reality. You actually go into quite like a low headspace when they don't meet one another. And for many of us, we're just effectively setting our expectations very, very high for life. The reality might not meet it. The expectations are being set so high largely because of social media and what we're seeing is possible. And then it can mean our happiness is dipping quite a lot as a result.
Which is why so commonly, right, you think there might be even things you dread going to, right? There might be like a party or something that you've accepted an invite to, and you think, God, I really don't sort of feel like it. And then you get there and it exceeds all expectations and it's super fun.
Yes, that's like exactly the same situation, but in the opposite way. And it doesn't mean like have no expectation for life. You want to obviously have dreams and goals and all these kind of things, but you just want to be careful of like over setting expectations. Like I was, I'm trying to think of a scenario now, but I met my now girlfriend on Instagram and she was from Australia. So I ended up like falling in love with this girl on Instagram and decided to fly to Australia to go and meet her. And on the plane there, I was, of course, very excited. I was thinking, oh my God, like this, she's so cool. And like, I really am excited to meet this girl. But I was also conscious based on this idea of like, don't set my expectations so high that it's going to be the best moment of my life. Because then even if it's a good moment, it might under deliver and then feel a bit underwhelming. And it's always then just like, even when you are looking forward to something, just setting like a realistic expectation level is very important to make sure you then are more likely to enjoy the experience that's coming.
Yeah, that makes total sense. How would we do that then? You mentioned goals there. How can people do that in relation to goals? Because as you say, we want to have big goals, right? And achieve everything we want in life. We get one chance at it. So how does that dovetail with goal setting?
Yeah, it's very interesting because the main thing when you look into like goal setting, expectations, your drive towards them is this whole concept of your pursuit of a goal itself. And what's really interesting, there's this fascinating scientist called Schultz that came from Cambridge University who did a big area of research into dopamine and then like when is our dopamine level its highest. And often we can think that with goals, our dopamine is going to be highest, like the most rewarding moment is going to be when we achieve the goal. Like that would be quite an obvious way to think. So it's like when I eventually get the new house or the new job or the paycheck or the followers or whatever it might be, some kind of goal that people are seeking to attain. With this research, they came to discover that our dopamine is actually higher just before we actually attain the thing we desire. Our dopamine and our enjoyment of a goal is actually highest, not when we get it, but when we feel like we're pretty close to getting it. And the main thing when you look into dopamine and neuroscience and goals and stuff is just to not be putting all your weight on the attainment of them, but be putting more of your focus into making sure you're simply in the pursuit of something at all times effectively. So whether that's down the health route or the family route or creative route or work route, but it's more important that you're simply in the pursuit of a goal than just constantly focusing on what life is going to be like when you've attained them. And that helps you then manage the expectation reality.
Okay, so the journey to get there is what's driving a lot
That's
of that.
when the brain, from a neurobiological standpoint, is happiest. It's actually in the pursuit of it, not when it's attained. And when you look into dopamine, like the chemical actually evolved in our brain in order to help us do the hard things that kept humans alive. So when we had to like hunt for food and build shelter and so on. And if you actually think about the niche example of having to hunt for food, dopamine is this chemical that motivated us and focused our brains. It would obviously be more useful that the dopamine was highest just before we successfully managed to get hold of the food so that we'd be in the most motivated and focused state than once we get it, then having the spike of dopamine. So it kind of makes sense evolutionarily that being in the pursuit of something is actually more important.
Yeah, that does make sense. And what about if a goal is taking a little bit longer than we were hoping, for example? How do we maintain that level of motivation?
Effectively, you want to make sure you're always getting closer to a finish line. You want to be having a finish line in sight. And say, for example, writing this book, like that was a big task to like put my entire brain into a book. And it was very important for me in order to maintain a high dopamine level. And I'm always thinking through these lenses. But if your dopamine is high, you're going to be in a more motivated state. And when I handed this opportunity, I was given a deadline of like a year or 9 months or something in order to get that book to them. And I remember thinking like, that's so far in the future. That goal is so long term that that's not going to motivate me in the now to make sure I work at a really good, hard pace in order to get this book done. So I then broke the book down into these 4 chemicals and into these parts and gave myself specific deadlines effectively for those things to be complete. And I would completely forget about the long-term goal of writing the book. And I would only have the specific short-term goal in mind. And it was, once I achieved that, that in itself is a dopamine hit. That's an enjoyable moment. That means I can then rest for a period of time. But it's effectively, if there is a big long-term goal, it needs to be broken down into nice small chunks where the end point of each stage is within like a week or two. So you feel like it's attainable in the near future. So your dopamine remains high in the pursuit of it.
Okay, interesting. So really chunking it down into smaller
Chunking
steps.
it down is good for sure, especially in a world where like it's super hard to get started and we procrastinate loads and stuff like that. You want like attainable things to try and get some momentum, get yourself to take action.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to come on to the dose in just a moment. Another thing that I picked up from the book is the voice that can get in the way, right, of us achieving things is that inner voice, that self-criticism. That happens to all of us to a greater or lesser degree. What's going on there, and how can we minimize? How can we make it a voice that is helpful to us, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating. This is something that I really struggled with a huge amount. I would say in my low periods of mental health, I would say that voice in my head has been brutal. It's been very critical of all aspects of my life, work or looks or relationships, whatever it might be, a super critical voice. And I was someone that was very, and am still, but very much work on it hard now, but was very addicted to my phone. And part of the addiction to the phone is definitely like the dopamine stimulation or the enjoyment that the phone can create for our brain. But particularly for people that struggle with like a negative inner voice, a lot of the addiction is actually being fueled by a fear of the quiet. And if we're in the quiet, that voice comes out to talk to us and we think, oh no, I don't like hearing these thoughts. So it's easier to distract myself with my phone. Because as soon as you've got TikTok scrolling or something, those thoughts are silent and you're just engaged with whatever's in front of you. And for me, I started to realize like, wow, I really can't spend any time in the quiet. And I did this mindfulness course. I found it super hard. This is about 4 or 5 years ago. And I then set myself this goal. I at the time just couldn't feel like mindfulness was possible. So I thought I'd go on walks in the quiet without my phone. Stepped out into the quiet, discovered like my negative voice in my head was super tough to deal with. And then eventually, like after spending enough time out there in the quiet, I did this each day. I actually credit these quiet walks as the most substantial thing that's ever healed my mental health of any action. I think it's the most important step that people can take. And I started then thinking like, how do I actually get my brain to say nice things to myself? Because it's naturally oriented to such a strong critique. And this can be to do with like your parenting, growing up, and loads of factors can impact it. But effectively, through the idea of neuroplasticity, which is the idea our brain can rewire and change over time, I started thinking like I need to almost force positive thoughts into my brain of how I communicate with myself, but they need to be genuine and they need to be true thoughts. So I started asking myself the question, rather than walking around thinking I'm not enough and I'm not good at this and this is bad and da, 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 I started thinking like, where is some progress happening in my life? And at the time it was as simple as I've managed to go for a walk without my phone. Like that was a huge achievement. And I started this protocol every day of like, how can I just learn to actually say well done to myself in my brain for stuff to do with my work, relationships, phone, food, whatever it might be. And gradually over time, I noticed this like massive rewiring of that internal communication. And my brain became much better at noticing when it was being very unkind to itself and much more capable of actually saying kind things. And we then integrated this as a big part of D.O.S.E in terms of all the live training we do and stuff. And it appears those that learn to celebrate achievements, learn to celebrate progress, end up with a far better voice within their mind.
And it's interesting because you've amassed like a big following. So it seems like the outward results are also reflecting that inner shift that you saw. How much do you think that changing that inner voice has itself contributed to your success?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm very interested by the idea of kind of like manifestation and stuff like that. I think there's some really cool areas of research there that are growing. I think they've been like in their infancy, but they're growing. And I do think if you just think like almost physics wise or anything about the universe, if you focus your attention far more on what is going to plan, it's likely that thing is going to happen more frequently. And if your brain is very focused on the negative, at least mine was, it felt like it was almost reinforcing negative experiences to occur. So I do think that communication has been really important. I also am someone that can just struggle with confidence and stuff like that. I can lose my confidence a bit in my working life or my social media life or whatever it might be. And that's when then the negative self-talk starts to grow, and then you start to lose your belief. So I found like in order to remain a confident human that like can share about these ideas and stuff, it's been very integral. I would say working on the inner voice stuff is like right at the very core. It's like the most important thing really with our mental health.
The core of it, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I was reading some content by Dr. Jim Doty, who's a neuroscientist and kind of links neuroscience with manifestation. And he was talking about the default mode network and how it's so important because of that resting system. It can either be like helping you daydream in a positive way, or it can be really negative with that inner voice. And so that programming that you're discussing there is what he was recommending to actually reprogram. So the default mode network is behaving differently. And then sort of bringing that neuroscience to the world of manifestation. And it's interesting how these worlds are coming together.
Definitely. I think naturally, especially in a social media world, I think many of our default mode networks are orienting towards like critique and maybe some negative thoughts in our mind. And both the celebration of achievements, but also grateful thinking is something I make a massive prioritization of. So if there are situations where I don't know, I'm bored, I'm sitting in like a hairdresser waiting for a haircut, whatever it might be, I try and have periods where I don't just always take out my phone. It's like been a big thing to try and change my relationship with my phone. Is like, if I'm bored, it doesn't mean I have to go on social media. And then I'll sit there, and effectively at that point, you're heading towards default mode network. And if those thoughts can orient towards, like if you are someone that struggles with negative thinking, towards grateful thoughts or the celebration of progress, it just appears that you end up in a much more like calm, happy headspace than if your brain like naturally starts going, oh, this is going wrong and this happened with my kids and and then you can start going into the more worrisome side. So it's definitely good to train the DMN.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's like there's energy behind a thought as well, isn't it? Like when you have one thought, if you give attention to it, then it kind of another thought comes along. It's almost like putting a search into YouTube or something or social media. You end up seeing more of what you search when your brain seems to do the same.
Definitely. Like our brain doesn't, it's just an incredible computer. And if it starts heading down the negative, it's very good at going very far down that route very quickly. And it also has the same capacity on the positive. It's just the negative is a little bit more fear driven, and our brains are very good at responding to fear because it wakes us up and gets us energized. So it's important to have strategies in place that can orient you towards the positive if you're going to spend time in the quiet, which we really do need.
Yeah, I noticed that actually when I was looking at, we're going to go through the dose. So when I was looking at the serotonin keys that you'd put, actually, I noticed how one of those keys was nature, and you had put socializing in nature, but also importantly, spending time on your own in nature and having that connection, which for you sounds like it's been enormous. And it has been for me as well, very powerful.
Yeah, I think it can be for lots of people one of the most like uncomfortable things to do. Like there's things that people fear, like I know public speaking is one like the worldwide fears is like as like a top thing, the similar to touching spiders and stuff. And in our research at the Dose Lab, we asked many people like, do you ever walk without headphones in and stuff like that? And in all of our data, about 85% of people would always have something playing in their ears if they walked in nature. And I see it like on my walks. I very rarely will see someone not with a phone or headphones in their ears. And therefore, your brain is not effectively hanging out with itself. It's hanging out with whatever that stimulation is. And I think for many of us, our brain and body is a very incredible, intelligent machine. And it's here to guide us really towards survival. Like at its core, it's trying to get us to procreate and have relationships and eat food and sleep and work and provide and all these sort of things. Like that's what our brain is just naturally oriented towards doing. And there's a lot of stuff that's disrupting our ability to thrive as a human now, like our nutrition and alcohol and our phones and so on. And we then, as a result, are getting a lot of messages from our brain and body saying, please, can you stop doing this? Can you put your phone down? Can you drink less? Can you eat less sugar? And so on. But they're annoying, uncomfortable thoughts. So we just always distract ourselves away from them. And I think if someone goes consistently into nature, because it's such a good calming environment, it's great for your serotonin, which stabilizes your mood and so on, goes out there and then actually hears those thoughts and starts to have a conversation with themselves, they then start to actually hear the guidance that the brain and body is suggesting to them. And the more you actually listen to what your brain and body wants, ultimately the better your lifestyle becomes. You start thinking, oh, maybe I should sort out my sleep or my food or my relationship or so on. But we're living in a world where we're just constantly distracting ourselves away from these things. So then the thoughts never fully realized. So then they just sit there always knocking on the door, always making us feel a little bit crappy. Whereas if we spend some time with them, communicating with them, it's like cleaning out a filing cabinet. It like sorts it all out. You listen to the guidance, your behavior changes. And in all our work, it's one of the most significant things we see that changes people's lifestyles is just walking with themselves in nature, in the quiet.
I love that analogy of cleaning out the filing cabinet. It's kind of sorting through, isn't it? Or sort of detoxing those thoughts to a degree.
It is. And like, we can just like, I remember this room actually I'm in right now was really messy once because I emptied this cupboard and it was all really messy. And you could just keep looking in there and thinking, oh my God, I can't sort that out, and shutting the door. That's effectively what we're doing when we're always distracting ourselves away from the negative thoughts. Or you can go in there, and whilst that is a horrible experience, especially the first time you go in there, to start organizing it, eventually you will find that that whole room could be cleared up and organized. And the exact same thing can happen with our thoughts. And then if you start doing it on quite a consistent basis, it means each day or every few days, you're constantly kind of organizing the filing cabinet. So your brain and thoughts never get too overwhelming because you're constantly having this moment with yourself to sort them out. And I think it's really key.
I can imagine it can really help as well for people who struggle with like the 3 a.m. wake ups and they don't know why, because maybe they haven't processed. I mean, you'd be able to tell us more. Maybe they just haven't processed those things during the day. And as you say, they're kind of like knocking on the door, but not being dealt with because we're in this constant state of distraction.
Yeah, if our brain has a message that needs to be heard about something in our life, whether it's something to do with our relationship or our kids or health, whatever it might be, it will continue to knock louder and louder until the message gets heard. And like you see that with health, for example, someone can put off wanting to change their diet for a long time until they get a very significant health warning from their body saying, oh, now your stomach is in this situation or whatever. So that happens with our health. It also, with our physical health, that also very much happens with our mental health. And constantly ignoring the thought that is trying to guide you is not the answer to feeling your best. It's like an answer to temporarily ignoring it. And I think that is a big factor. Like waking up in the night thinking, oh God, I've got to think about this thing and I'm really stressed about it. That's then an annoying time to have to think about it because it's dark and your like mood's going to be a bit more stressed and you need sleep. So then your brain's worrying about that. Whereas a walk in nature is such like a natural experience for your brain and body. So there's going to be no better environment where you can navigate a challenging thought. And I just want to reinforce, like it can be really uncomfortable when you first do this. Like when I started doing this, I thought about my lifestyle was terrible. My addictions were terrible. And like, it wasn't like I just walked out there and thought, wow, nature is glorious and I'm just loving life now that I walk in nature. That was far from the reality. However, the consistent time out there, gradually it gets better and better. Now I do love the walks because my brain isn't too full of mess. However, we do need to like begin the cleaning effectively so that you're not cleaning it at nighttime.
I'd never thought of it in these terms, but I really like it. I like that idea because I think it's really important. And I think, it does concern me. I've got teenage children, just how much social media, because I grew up without social media, it wasn't available, and just how much they're growing up with constant distraction and constant people putting things in front of them, even just friendship groups, right? Whether it's on Snapchat or WhatsApp, just how many communications are coming into their phone at any point in time. That's why we encourage them to have breaks, but it's just that it's an unbelievable stimulus, and you think, how much time do you really get? That's why we have to regulate it as parents, right? Because they're not actually getting that time to have quiet time and connect with themselves.
And this is with the nature specifically is very understimulating in comparison to the phone, and it's almost the opposite. Like nature's obviously where humans spent 300,000 years. The phone is like the epitome of the modern world. And for a lot of young people, when they're asked to like take a break from their phone, the difficulty that can happen is when you're interacting with the phone, you're getting this big dopaminergic stimulation in a very rapid and pretty unnatural way, which is why it's like so good. You open TikTok, it's like, wow, I'm super stimulated. Pornography, for example, would be a really extreme version of like a rapid dopamine increase through the phone. And if, say, for example, the kid's been scrolling TikTok, whatever, and then the parents say you need to take a break, hoping that break is going to make them feel better. The difficulty that can happen is when you then take the dopamine stimulus away, take the phone away, the dopamine, it gets very confused because it's been so elevated and then suddenly it's not elevated. This isn't like hunting for an animal like we talked about earlier, where it takes 4 hours to get to a nice peak and then it would cool back down once you've got the food. This is rapid increase, rapid decrease. And then in the break where they're asked to come off their phone, they're actually going to not feel good because of this massive dopamine withdrawal that happens. This is called phasic and tonic dopamine. And it's similar to what happens like with a hangover for us as adults, like a very similar experience. You feel a bit more irritated and annoyed and your mood drops and so on. And for young people, it's very important for them to experience what it's like to push past that feeling for a longer period of time. So if it's like, okay, at dinner, we'll have 15 minutes without the phones, then you can have your phone back. it's only enough time for it to crash, feel pretty bad, and then get back into the phone. Whereas if on the weekend they experience, for example, being taken to nature and being told like, this is going to be hard, it's going to be effort, we're going to walk for 90 minutes without our phones, and you might not enjoy every moment. That's not even how life is designed to be, just like pure pleasure. It was designed to be really hard for hundreds of thousands of years. And what you see is at the beginning, they're like, oh, kind of annoyed. Like, oh, why mum and dad making me walk in nature? By the time they get home, and then eventually they can go on their phone again, their dopamine has crashed from the phone, climbed really naturally all the way back up into a nice elevated experience. And then their brain is way happier than prior to the phone. But you need to effectively detox for a prolonged period to let it fully recharge the chemical.
That's really interesting, because it's something I think inherently we must know. Because I remember, and I think you mentioned the lockdowns in the book. That's when we spent a lot of time in nature, because there wasn't anything else to do. You could go out for an hour a day and do that. And my kids still really remember it as just a time of connection. And they'll often say, can we go for a really long, and it's always a really long walk. Do you know what I mean? Not, can we just go for a dog walk? Can we go for a really long dog walk?
That's
which must
unreal.
mean they have some recollection of it. Yeah. That's there from those times, effectively.
And I think particularly in the first lockdown that we got given, a lot of people have quite a fond memory of the nature experience that happened there. Everyone slowed down a bit. I think for many people, obviously, aside from the fact there was this pandemic happening, people's home lives, actually, some people felt better in that first lockdown because they slowed down a bit. They spent more time in nature, more time connecting with their families. Then I think the next lockdowns became more sit on your phone the whole time. But I think that first one, we did have a massive increase in nature. Loads of people talking about hearing the birds in that first lockdown. I remember that being a huge thing. And as humans evolve into this super techie digital species, it's just very important we don't forget that we spent 300,000 years running around in a forest, and our brain needs that experience as well. We can't just be people that sit on Zoom and phones all day. We have to have the other thing to rebalance it.
Yeah, it's very true. Let's go through the dose, right? So it is dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And there were definitely some surprises for me in here. We've talked a bit about dopamine there, and this sort of cheap form of dopamine, and how we should earn it. I guess one of the questions I have, you mentioned flow states as an area I've looked at, and I've had Stephen Kotler on, the founder of the Flow Research Collective. Yeah, it's really interesting. And, you know, it's a state that we all want to access, right? When you're in flow, it's enjoyable and you lose that concept of time. But often you find, if you look at athletes and things and successful people, they're achieving even when they're not in flow, right? Sometimes there is just that struggle, right? And it's kind of at the razor's edge, if you like. What should we be aiming for the purposes of high performance, and how can we can go into some of the ways in a moment of improving dopamine and some of the other neurotransmitters, but what could our expectations be around how much time do you think we can sensibly focus for any period before we start to lose that concentration, and then it becomes kind of the law of diminishing returns?
Yeah, I think for many people, the challenge is probably more on the side of not actually successfully getting there than spending too long in there. It would take, for the brain to begin to center its attention towards this like hyper-focused flow state type area, it's going to take at least 15 minutes of staying on exactly the same task. So you and I, for example, in this conversation, because it's like very engaging and we're looking at one another, it's quite easy for our brains to focus. When we come off this call and you might have to do your email and you get some WhatsApps and you've got an Instagram and stuff, suddenly your brain is doing many tasks at once, and then it's not in a centered attention. It's not only focused on one thing. So when we're trying to get towards these states, the first thing is, are you only doing one thing, or are you on your computer doing lots of things at once? That's not flow state. Doing one thing is flow state. And then I would say you can push the brain to about 60 to 75 minutes before it then needs a significant break to recharge the dopamine, because flow state is naturally very good for dopamine. Our previous ancestors, hunter-gatherers, would have spent their lives in flow state, like building and hunting and making fires, and that would have been a very flow statey experience. The challenge we have is basically some of us get into flow state if our attention gets really locked in on a specific task and we make sure our phone isn't near us and so on. The difficulty then comes is you finish your task and you then seek for a reward, and then you think my reward will be either your phone, or it might be going and getting some like chocolate out the cupboard, for example. That's like those two rewards, like phones and sugar, are the main things we often seek for. And at that point, we've just done all this like natural dopamine building, and then we have the reward as a dopamine spike and then a crash. And then if you wanted to try and get back into a state of concentration again that day, you're coming from a lower dopamine state. So if you're wanting to be a human that spends lots of time in flow state, you want to have these deep states of focus, but then on your breaks, you want to do what's called like broad attention tasks, which basically means rather than like phone or sugar or staying on the computer, these are quite narrow attention. You go and talk to someone, you go and walk around, you go and make a cup of tea, you go outside for 5 minutes, but something that doesn't require your brain to stay focused on one thing, something that lets your attention rest effectively. And then you can spend more time in these flow states.
And then it's easier to get back into it.
Much easier.
Yeah, it was what was interesting to me when we were looking at these neurotransmitters is that you mentioned, which I knew about, cold exposure is a great way of kind of earning that dopamine. But then you mentioned heat in relation to serotonin, which is do you want to actually first, do you want to just talk us through what dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins are, what the effects of those are in the body?
Yeah, so dopamine evolved to create all of our motivation and drive to do hard things. So that is the function of dopamine. Oxytocin is here to connect humanity together and build relationships. Serotonin manages our mood and our energy levels. And then endorphins is a very useful chemical that effectively has the capacity to de-stress our brain. And it often occurs as a result of physical movement, will be the thing that de-stresses it, something that's physical. And each of the four then serves that function: motivation, connection, energy levels, and the ability to de-stress us. And then there's actions that correspond to all these different things that can support our brain and body.
Thank you for that. So then kind of going back, so cold exposure can help with dopamine, but it seems heat exposure helps with serotonin, as does sunlight, which you also mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting. So cold water immersion actually creates quite a significant rise in our adrenaline, and because of the shock that can happen in our body. And adrenaline and dopamine kind of work as cousins neurobiologically in our brain and body. So because of the spike of adrenaline, dopamine then comes in as well to support, effectively to sharpen our focus and motivation. Like if you look at areas like skydiving, people can get addicted to skydiving and they're called adrenaline junkies. They're actually getting addicted to the dopamine it's creating because of the adrenaline that is being released because of the ridiculous fear of jumping out of a plane. So cold water immersion does adrenaline, which then corresponds with this big dopamine rise. It motivates us and focuses our brain. The sunlight side of thing is very much serotonin based. Anything that really elevates like the health of our body, sunlight, being out in nature, breathing calmly, sleeping, nutrition, these things that really you would think of as things that are impacting literally your body, they are awesome for our serotonin. The heat area, which is things like saunas and hot baths, is actually the endorphin system. That's the system that can de-stress us. And endorphins basically evolved that if ever we were under stress, which could have been like extreme hunger or extreme physical danger, evolutionarily, we weren't stressed by sort of reading our phone and reading the news or looking at our bank balance or whatever. Evolutionarily, stress was just like a physical experience of I need food or I'm in danger. Those are the two big stresses. And then stress was always correlated with physical action, like we'd have to run or fight or whatever it might be. And our body evolved so that in the moment where we used our physicality to run or fight, endorphins would release to take stress out of our brain so that we weren't running along thinking, I'm going to die, I'm so hungry, or I'm going to die, I'm in danger. We just got focused on the task at hand. And nowadays, we obviously don't have those kind of stresses. But if you do physically use your body through running and stretching and stuff like that and exercise, those are endorphin boosters. But you also see a similar effect occur in things like saunas, because when you're in these hot environments, your body almost perceives physical danger and then endorphins release. So these are great for de-stressing us.
Okay, yeah. And I remember when I was speaking with Stephen Kotler, he was recommending sauna actually as a way of helping recovery from a flow state when you've kind of depleted a lot of those neurotransmitters and then helping you get back in flow.
Yeah, that would be a smart idea for sure. It'd be activating a very different side of the brain. So the attentional resources, motivation, dopamine side would get to recharge for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. For someone who is struggling with mental health, right? So someone who maybe feels that either they struggle with low mood or maybe they just feel destabilized with their mood, and they don't know why. Some days they wake up, they feel really positive. Other days they're having to really like generate that motivation, whether it's through exercise or something else. What do you think is that? Is it down to their thoughts? Is it down to their gut health? I mean, it could be any number of these things, but I'm just curious because I think people often feel a bit helpless about it because they don't really know what's causing it, so they don't know how to fix it.
I would, obviously, everyone is in unique situations. If you were to look at your life, if you're going through a very significant life event, like, for example, someone passing away or a job transition or a divorce, these are very significant life events that are going to have a big impact on your mental health. If you weren't currently navigating one of those really significant life events, but you still felt you had really poor mental health, I would then think it's much more of a behavioral issue to do with how you're spending your time. And as a result, your brain chemistry is getting impacted. And we have this in all of our research. Like, if people are navigating those things, there's a path to take towards relationships and connection and stuff like that. If you're not experiencing one of those, but you're feeling very low, I would very much hypothesize that it's connected with dopamine and that your dopamine system is being overstimulated via either social media or sugar or alcohol or pornography, these kind of things that are overstimulating the dopamine pathway. Because they overstimulate it, you then end up in this very low dopamine state. It's very like if I got into my car every day, if I had a manual car and I got in it every day and didn't put it into gear, but I revved the engine every morning, if I did that for a few months, I would break the engine. When we have these really dopaminergically stimulating activities like social media and like sugar and like alcohol, effectively it's revving the dopamine engine far too hard and it's breaking the mechanism. Eventually, you then end up with this dopamine system that doesn't work very well and you're just in low dopamine. And how low dopamine feels is this kind of flat, deflated, procrastinating, just like life just does not feel very exciting and interesting to you. You don't really have like that zest for life. And that's exactly where I found myself for like 10 years. And I would really recommend, like, if someone's in that situation, absolute job one is changing how they start their day in the morning. I think when we look at our work, many people we work with at the NHS, the doctors and staff at the NHS, we work a lot on how their day begins. And then you see a big translation to their mental health and what goes on from there. I would start with altering the beginning of their day.
That is super interesting because actually, when you look at the medical system, if someone's depressed, the first thing they recommend is an SSRI to kind of pull the serotonin. Whereas what you're saying there is that it seems more related to this overstimulation of dopamine.
It's really interesting. And I always have to preface that I'm not a psychiatrist. I didn't train in that side, so I don't prescribe medication. I think medication can be like a route that can help people for sure. Taking an SSRI is taking like a mood stimulating pharmaceutical drug. So like your mood will elevate with an SSRI, which then could kind of like take away the negative experience that's taking place, like when you experience that rise in serotonin. So there's logic as to why it would help. I really believe, like from everything I've read and written about, that there's a real relationship between depression and the dopamine system. When you look at the experience of depression, I spent years in this state. It's extremely hard to take action when you have depression. It's like you can't really be bothered to do anything at all. Like people say, like, just start eating better, sort your gut health out, go for walks, exercise, do all this stuff and you'll feel great. But you're in a state where doing anything at all is hell. And if you're in that state where even going for a shower or making your bed is hell, that's a very much a dopamine related experience in the brain. You're lacking the molecule that gives you the will to do the hard stuff. And many people in our society are low in dopamine because it's not serotonin that gets stimulated by social media and alcohol and so on. It's dopamine that gets very overstimulated by it. And if we were looking at anxiety, I'd have a whole different lens. But if it's specifically like low mood depression, I think it's very, very much a dopamine related challenge.
Interesting. So these are the things in the book where you talk about having things like a dopamine fast, right? A phone fast, things like that to actually reset your natural dopamine levels.
Whenever we experience a hit of dopamine, it's very pleasurable and then it creates a desire for another one. So when we hunted the animal down, our brain was like, wow, this is amazing. Let's make sure I go out in a few days and do this again so that we have more food for the family, or building the shelter or scratching the rocks and making the fire. Like, it made sense that a dopamine rewarding experience would motivate us to do that thing again. But we could only access those like elevations in dopamine maybe 2 or 3 times a day, like food, fire, maybe some connection, maybe we had sex, but it wasn't like all day, every day, loads of dopamine hits. When you wake up in the morning, if your brain gets a dopamine hit from the phone, like you wake up and you're like, oh, WhatsApp or Instagram or email or whatever it is that you're hooked on, news, your brain then goes, oh, that was nice. I just got a dopamine hit. Let's get another one of those. And then you've primed your brain from the moment it wakes that that's going to be its source of dopamine throughout the day. And if you prime your brain on the other direction of, I got my dopamine from something that was hard, like making your bed or brushing your teeth or having a shower, which even if you're in a depressed state, like sometimes you can get yourself to just take like 5 minutes of time before you get to the phone. You've then primed your brain more towards the effortful side. In our data at the lab, we have like 75% of people go on their phone as soon as they wake up in the morning. And it's not surprising, like the phone is the alarm and you wake up and think, oh, what's the harm? And if you were thriving, I would say keep doing what you're doing. But if you were struggling with your mind and you are waking up and getting dopamine from the phone, like that is the absolute number one thing to change at the beginning.
You know what's interesting there is it begs the question then, people who are tracking their sleep with things like the Aura Ring or the Whoop, I mean, that in itself becomes addictive, right? It's like, oh, I wonder what did I get? Did I get a good recovery score?
I actually got addicted to Whoop. I got really, and I then had the expectation reality thing to come back to the beginning of the conversation where I would have a really good night's sleep. So then my brain would have an elevation of expectation of what my recovery score was going to be. I'll be like, oh, it's got to be an 85. I'm going to get a green. And then because I set a high expectation and it came out as like a 57, I would then be annoyed. I'd be like, why the hell have I got a low score? Then I go into analysis. And because of all the colors of green, like our brain is very primed for all these different colors as well. And it's those devices that are interesting because I think they can be helpful. I found my Whoop originally like really helped me understand what alcohol was doing to me. Like I was like, wow, this is quite shocking what it's doing to my heart when I'm drinking alcohol. However, I think there can be you can reach a point where you've taken it too far effectively, where you're now just hooked on the numbers, and there's like a balance to strike with it for sure. I actually had to take mine off because I got too
Did you? I think that's the thing, right? And I think actually, like some of the metrics, like, you know, did we get enough deep sleep? How's your HRV are better than, say, the algorithmic ones, because I don't think they necessarily really do predict properly how we're feeling and things like that. But you know where I've noticed it being addictive? It's ridiculous. This sort of game I've got into is you can track your strength training in the gym. So then you go in.
I think they updated that like when I left it. Yeah, how does it work?
Yeah, so you put your put the weights you're using in, the number of repetitions. So then what I've noticed is calf raises in particular seem to add a massive amount of strain, or leg workouts, which would be understandable, right? A leg workout. But what happens is then I think, I've worked out really hard. I've lifted some really heavy weights. You look at like the total tonnage it gives you. And then if you look at it and you go, well, my strain wasn't as high as last time I did this leg workout. And I'm just like, I'm not sure I should just come out of the gym feeling great. So it's funny, isn't it? It's this interesting relationship with technology and how it affects our brains.
Technology is like just such an interesting thing where it's both the most incredible thing humans have ever made, but also the most challenging thing. It's not like all the other dopamine things we created, like alcohol and sugar and stuff. They're more like obviously creating quite significant challenges for us. Like we know that we drink alcohol, we just get like a hangover straight away. Whereas the phone is like this very complicated device that could teach you about your exercise, but then that also could disrupt your exercise. It's both at play. So in general, I think if society could become more comfortable with separating from the phone, I think we'd end up in a better place.
More intuitive. Alcohol definitely like positively giving that up positively impacted my mental health, and it makes sense what you're saying.
You actually gave it up completely, did you?
Wow. So I haven't intentionally given it up forever. I initially did like a year, and I thought I'll do it for a year, and then when I got to the end of the year, I was at that point where I was like, I've got a streak, like quite a long streak. The competitive part of me was like, I don't really want to break the streak, and actually my kids were like, I prefer you without alcohol. I think because I've had so many mental health issues, I'm much more stable without it, which is interesting what you were saying, because if you have a drink, it's not that I would ever really drink to excess, but I know that feeling of that dopamine hit, right? When you have a glass of wine and you're like, oh, that feels good. Now you'll have the second because of it,
Definitely.
So I'm kind of like, I then basically thought, I'll just create this arbitrary deadline. I'll go, why not make it 1,000 days instead of a year?
Wow.
But I've only got about 3 months left.
Of 1,000 days?
So I don't know what to do now. Yeah.
That's so incredible. Congratulations. Like that is not easy to do in our world. Like our world is so set up to just keep drinking. So it's really admirable that you've done that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey because my husband did it for a year and then he stopped. He'll have the odd drink
Yeah.
now. And it's been strange. It's definitely a time, I would say, of personal transformation. I've got to know myself a lot better because you
Yeah.
can't, when there's no drugs, there's no alcohol, you can't look
Hmm.
outside of yourself, right? It's only
Yeah.
so yeah, it's been an interesting journey, but I'll see where I
I
end up
think you
at
should
the end of it.
continue it. I reckon it's an amazing idea to continue. I reckon if you've got that far, like your body and brain will be so far from having a dopaminergic relationship with it that it's like amazing to have got that far. I would
Yeah.
say if it feels possible to continue, it would be amazing. And
Yeah,
I
no,
say
it
that from
does.
the perspective of someone that took a big break and then had some and then regretted that. So like it would be
So
cool
it'd
to
be
continue if
interesting.
you can.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I sort of feel like if I did, I would regret it, if I had some now. But I think,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting you say about that dopaminergic, I can't even get the words out, but that relationship,
Dopaminergic.
dopaminergic relationship, because now I no longer, it wouldn't even occur to me. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
it's,
because the conversation between the brain chemical and the substance has like faded away, like a relationship breaking up. And like when
mm,
you break up with a partner, it's like savage for like a year. You have all these thoughts about them, and then gradually you just find like it fades off when you've broken up with someone for enough time. And dopamine has this very intelligent way in which it operates called anticipatory dopamine, where it can rise simply at the thought of getting hold of dopamine. So if, say, for example, I was sitting in the tribe and I saw that two of the blokes were going off hunting, my brain would get a dopamine rise at the thought that they were hunting to motivate me to go and hunt with them. So I would experience this like, oh, I should do the same. With that idea of anticipatory dopamine, if you're walking through the supermarket and you see the bottle of Mango Absolute, I used to like those Mango Absolute vodkas. Like if you see it, your brain actually gets an increase in dopamine just at the thought of having it, not even if you have it. So then for you, the conversation is reduced because they haven't had a chance to talk to one another in so long, which is why I'd say it's amazing to continue because that conversation is like fully broken up. Whereas going back is like texting the ex after 1,000 days.
well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. And actually, you probably wouldn't trust yourself going back, right, and speaking to your ex. And I don't know
No.
how much I would trust myself because could I then be that person? Like it actually had become, I don't know if it was the same for you, but for me, it had become a mental crutch. So, I'd been on antidepressant and antipsychotic medication for many years. So when I transitioned off all of that, the last piece was, can I give up the alcohol? And so now I don't think I'm really fully trusting of what that relationship would be. It is kind of the bad ex. Do you know what I mean?
And the challenge is because you haven't had it in so long, it would feel really, really good if you drank it. It would be
Mm.
like very dopaminergic, and then your brain would be like, "Wow, why haven't I been having this for the last 1,000 days? This is great." And then you'd have the big rise. Then the next day, the big like fall. So I say it more out of desire and envy that I would like to try and achieve the same. And I like the fact you're that far in the path. It makes me want to guide you to continue because I'd like to try and get there myself.
Oh, thank you, TJ. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Keep me posted on what you do.
Yeah, I've done like 2 6.5 month breaks in a row, and then I've had one night where I've drunk alcohol. I've had 3 or 4 drinks. Then I decided, nope, I don't really like drinking. And then the 6.5 month break has begun again. So for some reason, both times around 7 months, I had a drink. Then the same thing happened both times. I thought, no, I don't want to drink, but I still had it. Did it a second time. So
Yeah,
maybe it's all gone now. Let's see. I'm about
yeah, it might have
five
done.
months or something right now.
Oh, are you 5 months in? Congratulations. So it did happen that way for me. I kept doing 90 days, like either 30 days or 90 days, and then breaking it, and then
Yeah.
eventually, I think that's part of the path.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
my whole family are just like big boozers, and they've all had to quit because none of us seem to manage the relationship with it very well. And my sister and dad, they're at like 5 or 6 years now, and they say that like the desire, the conversation for it is just now completely dissipated. And for me, like I got 7 months, but the conversation definitely hadn't dissipated. I'd still be thinking, oh, that glass of red wine looks good. So yeah, I think you got to go for quite a long time to fully get out of it.
Yeah, I think you do. I think you're right. I think it's like a year and beyond that it really
Yeah.
starts to make it easier. On that note, do you think that some people just have a harder time? Like I'd read that people with ADHD are more likely to be addicted to gambling, pornography, drugs, and
Mm.
alcohol. Like, do some of us have brains that are just more likely to become addicted to things?
Yeah, everyone has what's called a baseline dopamine level, and it means just like at any one moment, regardless of what activity you're doing, if you're just sitting on the sofa doing nothing, your brain would be generating some dopamine. If it were generating none, you'd literally not be able to move. So it's generating some, and everyone has a baseline level, and everyone has a genetically altered baseline level. Like some people are naturally very high baseline dopamine levels. Some people are very low baseline dopamine levels. The difficulty is if you're someone that is predisposed to having slightly lower dopamine production, your engagement with dopamine is then very stimulating. So like if you imagine on a graph, like if you have a line and someone was like low down on the graph or someone was medium on the graph, both of you that drink the alcohol are heading up here. But the person who started from a lower level is going to experience a greater increase. So the pleasure of the alcohol or the porn or the sugar, whatever it might be, is going to be more substantial. And people that have ADHD, for example, have low baseline dopamine production. There's this great scientist called Volkow who did a lot of work on this. And that's why, like, we've been treating ADHD with Adderall and Ritalin. These are dopamine-based medications for many years, like decades. We've been using that to try and rebalance the dopamine baseline. And it's very difficult because we're now in a world where definitely people genetically have ADHD. They were born with it. That's a really challenging experience to have. And anything that's addictive is going to be very addictive. The additional difficulty we've got now is our modern lifestyles are lowering our baseline dopamine because we're burning this engine out because of the big spikes and crashes. So even if someone had pretty normal baseline dopamine throughout their life, they might have then in COVID started scrolling social media much more, and TikTok changed how stimulating phones can be with this new video format. And then they've gradually like lowered their baseline level. So it can be a genetic thing, it can be a lifestyle thing. But being in low baseline dopamine makes everything very, very exciting and stimulating, and therefore very, very addictive.
Yeah, so that obviously it makes sense then, doesn't it? That, you know, as someone with mental health, a background in mental health, actually giving up alcohol has been such a positive, because I would have had that big rise from just one drink, right? That you're talking about, one or two drinks, compared to maybe a low baseline.
Throughout this period of coming away from it, you'll have done other things with your time. I don't know when you launched this podcast, but you'll have launched this podcast and done all your work stuff and hung out with your kids and all that sort of stuff. And without the big spikes and crashes, and with the increased hard work that you're doing, like the extra actions you're taking with your health or exercise, whatever it might be, you'll have actually over the last few years created an increase in your baseline dopamine. Like your brain will naturally each day generate more dopamine now than it would have a number of years ago when you were drinking. So then you find you start getting into these more motivated states as a human being. And this is why, like, there's always the correlation between someone goes sober, especially at the beginning, someone goes sober and then they get very, very productive. They're like suddenly really into their fitness or their food or their work, or they launch a new company or whatever it might be, because they no longer have this thing that's breaking their baseline dopamine, and suddenly their dopamine rises and they have this like overwhelming desire to pursue life. And that's how a human is designed to be. Without all this dopamine stuff, we'd all be like that. All the hunter-gatherers were 10 out of 10 motivation levels. But now in our modern world, we're disrupting it.
Isn't that interesting? Because during that period, I would say probably in the last 12 months, I can name on one hand the times that I haven't made a morning workout. So I have become much more, consistent with things. But I'm really going to take away what you said about social media, because I notice if I put my phone away or don't have it for the weekend, I think it's hard, isn't it? When you're the same as me, when you work in an industry where people are contacting you and things. But I find when I put that away, again, just a big improvement in mental health.
I think we need to like become okay with the idea of being separated from it. I think a lot of it is the dopamine addiction, but a lot of it is we actually get this like uncomfortable feeling of like, what's going on over there on the phone? Like, what's happening with my WhatsApp groups and And humans obviously were perfectly fine before we all had big WhatsApp groups and so on. Like we were surviving as a species prior to having smartphones. And even, for example, maybe you don't want to go out of the house on your own without a phone, like if you have a safety concern there. But if you were with your partner, for example, and you're like, we're going to go for a coffee in town, you could, for example, leave your phones in the car and walk to the coffee shop. And that seems like a completely mind-blowing thing to do now, is to like leave your phone away from you. But you then discover, like, you sit down for your coffee and there's nothing to do except talk to each other, which is good for your oxytocin. And then you also have moments where your partner like gets up to go to the bathroom, and then you sit there, and always in that moment you would open your phone. Like that's what a human would do now. You'd always just be like, oh, what's going on? And then boom, dopamine. If you'll just sit there and then you're like, oh, I now just have to be in the quiet. And we think being in the quiet creates more fear and anxious thoughts and stuff, but really more time, like significantly increased time in the quietens down everything in our head, and it becomes much more peaceful. So yeah, the more we can learn as a society to just separate from it, I think the happier we're going to be.
Yeah, the better. Couple more questions, because I want to be very conscious of your time. So just 2 more questions. The first one is because, is that all right? So the first one is, because we hadn't talked about it, this was a big eye opener for me, was the link between oxytocin and not just connection and like we think of it as a love hormone, if you like, but confidence. And now I may have this completely wrong, but what was interesting to me is when you talk about, like, say, for example, I'm going on stage and I'm going to go and deliver a presentation. One of the first things I'll do, I'll use my breathing and slow that down. And there's lots on that, which is amazing. And everyone listening should 100% go get the Dose Effect, because there's just so many tips and how to bring yourself and calm yourself down, and the vagus nerve and all that. So I do that before I go on stage. But then the next thing I do is, as I enter, is I look at the energy of the audience, because I want to impart something to them. Hopefully they're going to come away with something, and I want to be in that energy. And when I do that, it seems to increase also confidence at that point. Could that be oxytocin? I don't know. It just struck me when I was reading it.
That's super cool. The fascinating thing about oxytocin is, if oxytocin is higher, we are going to exhibit more confidence. Both people will perceive us as more confident, and we will feel more confident. And they've literally assessed this. They've done like these studies on groups of people. You can take what's called intranasal oxytocin, like through your nose, and you'll see that someone's way in which they attribute themselves in their mind, talk to themselves in their mind, perceive themselves, rises in confidence when oxytocin increases. And that's if you clinically increase oxytocin. In that situation you're describing there, you feeling a sense of connection with that audience, and maybe you're pondering in your mind, how am I going to contribute to these people's lives? Contribution is a massive driver of oxytocin. Or just simply feeling their presence, seeing their eye contact, seeing them connecting with one another. That's then elevating your oxytocin, which in your brain is making you feel a greater level of confidence. And it's really interesting, this oxytocin, like when we're young, is very much driven by the relationship we have with our parents, and effectively like how much love are we receiving from the people that are raising us. And kids that feel very connected to their parents and then receive a lot of oxytocin, maybe through physical touch, maybe through words of affirmation, maybe through conversation or presence with them, whatever it might be, they're more likely to then be more confident because they've got higher oxytocin levels. And some kids that feel pretty disconnected through maybe no fault of their own, like they've grown up with parents they don't feel as close with, might then actually exhibit lower kind of social confidence and stuff. So there's this fascinating relationship between, if we can get the oxytocin up, confidence is going up as well.
How interesting. So actually just and helping a child become more confident, show them more love. It's really,
show them more love effectively. And it doesn't mean like be soft and like overly gentle on them, but it's more just like make sure you have really good connection with them, really present with them, eye contact, listen to them, ask them cool questions about what they find interesting. All that stuff makes a kid feel like they're seen, and is going to build like the oxytocin between that parent